Palestinians deserve the right of return. Now, there are several arguments against the right of return that I'll get into in a minute, but first I want to explain what the right of return is. So basically, in the late 1940s, there was a war between the Jews and the Arabs over the region of Palestine, and in 1948, 800,000 Arabs, or 80% of the Arabs in what is now Israel, were kicked out, and they fled to regions like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, this allowed the Jewish minority to become the vast majority of the state of Israel, and it solidified Israel's position as a strongly, firmly Jewish state. And the descendants of those Palestinian refugees now number about 5 million. So there are about 1 million, 1.2 million in Gaza, 800,000 in the West Bank, and then another 3 million in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And many of them live in refugee camps and want to return to Israel, return to their home, but Israel doesn't allow these Arabs to come back because Israel needs to maintain itself as a Jewish state. So a lot of people say, oh, it's unrealistic because most of the Palestinian refugees, they're only descendants of the people who were kicked out of their homes. Most of the people who actually fled in the 40s, they're dead now. It's unreasonable and it's unrealistic. It doesn't make any sense to allow these Palestinians to return when they weren't even born in Israel. They were born in Jordan and Syria or in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. It doesn't make sense to allow them to come back to Israel when they weren't the ones kicked out. It was their ancestors who were kicked out, so they must just deal with it. It doesn't make sense to allow people to return to a land that they weren't born in. Now, the reason why this is a terrible argument is because Jews have the right to return. Israel allows Jews all around the world to come and move into Israel based on, I guess, the idea that hundreds or thousands of years ago, Jews were all kicked out of the land of Israel by whoever was ruling the area at the time, the Romans or whatever, and Jews now want to return to their historical Holy Land. So that's why Israel allows Jews to have the right of return. So if you applied that same argument against the Palestinian right of return, you'd be saying, oh, how could you allow Jews to return to a land that they were never born in? These Jews were born in New York or in Russia. Their ancestors were kicked out of the Holy Land thousands of years ago. So because of that extreme contradiction, you can't tell me that the 5 million Palestinian refugees shouldn't be allowed to return to Israel because it was only their grandparents who were kicked out. Well, what about the millions of Jews who have moved to Israel because their great, however many great-grandparents were kicked out of the land? Jews have the right of return, so based on a much further period of time, they were displaced for thousands of years, whereas the Palestinian Arabs have only been displaced for 80 years or so. So, if anything, I would say that Arabs have a better argument for being allowed to return compared to Jews whose ancestors were kicked out thousands of years ago. So, if Jews are going to be allowed to have the right to return to Israel, then Palestinian Arabs should as well. Now, the other argument that people make is that there's just not enough space in Israel for 5 million extra Arabs. There just isn't enough space. It's a tiny little country. And yes, it is a tiny little country. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. If you brought in 5 million Arabs, it would might even be the most populated country in the world, or most densely populated country in the world. But I don't know, I don't see that as a good argument because Israel managed to make loads of space for millions of Jewish immigrants to move in, so if they could make space for them, they can make space for the Arabs. Especially considering the fact that you kicked out the Arabs in order to make more space for the Jews. It's a bit effed up to say that we'll make all this space for as many Jews to live here as possible, oh, but the Arabs who were kicked out here a couple decades ago, no, there isn't enough room for you. I don't buy it. There is enough room. They can make room for the Arabs who were displaced from their homes. The main argument against the right of return is that they need to preserve the Jewish state, the Jewish ethnic majority, and the Jewish majority will be threatened if they bring in 5 million Arabs. Now, that's just a racist argument. It really is, because you're saying they allow as many Jews to move in as possible, but they're saying we won't allow you to come in because you're Arabs, and even though you were kicked out of here 80 years ago, we won't allow you to come in because you're Arabs. We need to maintain a Jewish ethnic majority. That is just racist. You're excluding people from their right to not be displaced from their homes on the basis of their ethnicity. You're Arab, so you don't get to have the rights that Jews have. or you're an Arab who was born outside of Israel, you don't get to have the rights that Jews born outside of Israel have. You know, that is racist. So you can't morally base any laws or policies on a racist idea of having to maintain a Jewish ethnic majority, because that's just Jewish supremacism. Another issue I have with the not enough space argument is like, do you think the people in Gaza have a lot of space? You know, for decades, the Gaza Strip has been overpopulated because the vast majority of Gaza's population are actually descended from Palestinian refugees who were kicked out in the Nakba. So Gaza has never had much space. It's always been one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So what, the Palestinians must struggle with high population density, but no, the Jews, we can't have a high population density, or at least a high population density because of Arab immigration. Another thing that people say is that these Arab Palestinian refugees, they're anti-Semitic, they hate Jews. When they come in, they'll come and oppress Jews and mistreat Jews. And the thing is, Jewish immigrants have been coming in for decades, and they've been oppressing Arabs, mistreating Arabs, killing Arabs, stealing Arabs' land. So it's like, what, Jews are allowed to do oppression, and Jews are allowed to come in by the millions and kill and steal as much as they want, but when Arabs do it now, it's a problem. We can't have the right of return because we're worried that these refugees might want to hurt Jews. I do, to an extent, understand the concerns with a lot of poor refugees who know nothing about Jews other than their occupiers. A lot of these refugees coming in and settling in an area full of Jews. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to do violence? Are they going to do terrorism? I understand that that's a concern, but the concern that these Palestinian refugees might oppress Jews, might mistreat or kill or displace Jews, that doesn't justify Jews oppressing and killing and displacing Palestinians. You can't say we have to keep these Arabs displaced, otherwise we might be displaced. It's like, okay, they might displace you, there isn't evidence for that, but the concern that another group will oppress you is not justification to oppress them. With apartheid South Africa, which a lot of people bring up, whites were saying, we can't end apartheid, we can't end this oppression over blacks, because otherwise when the blacks take over, they'll do a reverse apartheid and they'll oppress and kill the whites. Well, that didn't happen, so it's not guaranteed to happen, and it doesn't justify oppressing another group of people just because you're concerned they might oppress you. The Israeli Jews are already mistreating Palestinians, so it's not a good argument to say that these Palestinians can't be allowed to return to their homes because they might oppress us. Because, you know, I don't have the answer for this, I don't have a strategy for how you do this part, but in South Africa, there wasn't a civil war, there wasn't a genocide against whites when apartheid ended, there wasn't a mass deportation of whites when apartheid ended. I don't know how they figured that out and how they prevented mass race war and ethnic cleansing, but I'm sure they could figure something like that out in Israel-Palestine. I don't have the exact answer for that though, but I do know that there are solutions other than just saying we have to keep 5 million Arabs displaced from their homes for the rest of eternity while we allow millions of Jews to come in from overseas the whole time in order to displace and occupy and kill more and more Arabs, you know? So those are the many reasons for why I support the Palestinian right of return. If you disagree with me, then let me know in the comments and we can have a comment war. But yeah, thanks for watching.